In February of 1948, a gypsum miner named Otis Renfro was working the return air drift of a shaft mine cut into a bluff above Eagle Chief Creek in Major County, Oklahoma, a few miles from the crossroads town of Ames. He was 37 that winter, a big-boned man who had come up from the Texas gypsum country as a boy and had worked underground in the gypsum seams of western Oklahoma for most of his adult life. The mine belonged to the Cimarron Gypsum and Plaster Company, a modest regional operator shipping calcined plaster and wallboard rock east to Enid by rail, nowhere near the scale of the larger gypsum companies already working the same belt of hills. Renfro's crew was driving a haulage crosscut that week through rock the company's consulting geologist had logged as clean, uniform gypsum with no faulting and no water. It does not appear in the congressional record summaries distributed to public libraries. At a little past 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, according to the account his daughter gave decades later, the drill steel dropped through the last foot of rock into open space, and the crosscut went quiet, in a way a working face does not usually go quiet. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Renfro widened the hole with a hand bar until it was large enough to put a carbide lamp through, and what the light found on the other side was not the honeycombed, water-carved hollow a gypsum miner expects to break into now and again. Gypsum is soft enough and soluble enough that natural voids are common in the Blaine Formation, the same layer of Permian-age rock that runs under most of Major, Woodward, and Blaine counties, laid down when a shallow inland sea evaporated in slow cycles roughly 270 million years ago, leaving behind alternating beds of gypsum, dolomite, and red shale. Groundwater moving through that rock for millions of years since has carved genuine caves into it, the same process that would later be opened to the public a short drive northwest at Alabaster Caverns, one of the largest gypsum caves in the country, accessible for public tours. A miner who has worked that formation for 20 years develops an eye for what a natural gypsum cavity looks like, rounded, irregular, scalloped by the slow chemistry of dissolving rock. What Renfro's lamp showed him, according to the account, was a chamber with walls closer to flat than curved, meeting the floor at an angle his daughter recalled him describing as square rather than worn, and a surface that did not carry the soft, sugary texture raw gypsum usually has underhand. It felt, in his own words as she remembered them, more like the inside of a cistern than the inside of a cave. Renfro paced the chamber himself before the shift boss arrived, the only measurement anyone ever took of it, and by his daughter's account, the space ran close to 18 feet across and just under 7 feet at its highest point, low enough that a tall man had to duck near the walls, but open enough to stand upright through most of the middle of it. The floor, unlike the walls, showed some of the ordinary irregularity Renfro expected from gypsum rock, a detail he apparently considered significant enough to mention specifically, since it meant whatever had produced the flat, square-cornered walls had not touched the floor the same way, or had not touched it at all. No artifacts, bones, tools, or organic material of any kind were reported inside the chamber, either by Renfro or by the 2 other men who described it independently to his daughter decades apart. It was, by every surviving description, simply empty, dry stone bounded by walls that did not match the rock around them, a fact that by itself explains neither more nor less than exactly what it says. 3 other men came off the haulage car to look before the shift boss was called down, and by the family's account, all 3 gave versions of the same detail independently. The chamber was dry at the moment they found it, dry in a formation where nearly every other void the mine had ever opened carried at least a seep of groundwater, and the air moving out of it was noticeably cooler than the working face around it. Cimarron Gypsum kept no formal record of any of this beyond a single line in the shift log for that date, later located by a regional historian doing unrelated research into the county's mining history. Crosscut advance halted, unexpected void encountered, superintendent notified. Nothing in that line hints at dimensions, contents, or cause, and nothing in the surviving company correspondence explains why a routine void of the kind the mine's own geological reports acknowledge occurred periodically throughout the property, would be worth a personal visit from the mine superintendent on a weekday afternoon. It would be dishonest to move further into this account without stating plainly that no independent survey, no state inspection report, and no academic excavation has ever confirmed the chamber's existence, its shape, or its contents, as Renfro is said to have described them. What survives is one shift log entry, one family retelling passed down across 3 generations, and the physical record of the wider gypsum country it sits inside, which is worth understanding on its own terms before any of it can be weighed fairly. The years immediately surrounding 1948 were, in fact, close to the high point of Oklahoma's gypsum industry as a whole. Wallboard demand had climbed sharply through the post-war housing boom, as returning veterans and their new families needed enough new construction to make gypsum board cheaper and faster to install than plaster lath, the standard material for interior walls across the country within a decade. Small regional operators like Cimarron Gypsum expanded output as fast as their equipment allowed, running crews on extended shifts through much of the late 1940s to keep pace with rail orders from Enid and Oklahoma City. And the pressure to keep a working face moving was, by every surviving account of the industry from that period, considerably higher than it would have been in a slower decade. A halted crosscut cost the company money for every hour it sat idle, which makes the extended pause, and the personal visit from a superintendent who by every other surviving record rarely left the office during a production week, harder to explain as an ordinary response to an ordinary geological nuisance. The Blaine Formation that Cimarron Gypsum was mining takes its name from Blaine County, Oklahoma, and it is one of the most thoroughly studied evaporite sequences in the American Southwest, mapped in detail by the Oklahoma Geological Survey across a belt running roughly from the Glass Mountains in Major County southeast toward the Canadian River. The gypsum in it precipitated out of restricted arm of the Permian Sea as the water evaporated faster than it could be replenished, leaving behind thick beds of calcium sulfate interlayered with red mudstone and dolomite. The whole sequence tilted gently and exposed today in the low white bluffs and mesas that give the Glass Mountains their name, so called by early settlers because the selenite crystals studding the gypsum caught the sun and threw it back like broken glass. Selenite, a clear, plate-like crystal form of gypsum, grows naturally in this rock, wherever mineral-rich water has had time and quiet space to precipitate it slowly, and the finest documented examples anywhere in the state come from the Great Salt Plains in neighboring Alfalfa County, where brine seeping up from the same Permian evaporite system through gypsum-bearing sand produces distinctive hourglass-shaped selenite crystals found nowhere else on Earth in that particular form, a phenomenon well documented by the Oklahoma Geological Survey and popular enough that the state allows the public to dig for them at a designated site within the Great Salt Plains State Park. That detail matters here for a specific reason. The same geological system that produces genuine, scientifically documented crystal formations in one county was, in Major County a short distance away, producing something Otis Renfro did not recognize as either a natural cave or a natural crystal bed. The same Blaine Formation that produced alabaster caverns has also produced Selman Bat Cave, a short distance farther north near the town of Freedom, a gypsum cavern now managed jointly by the state and by conservation biologists because it hosts one of the largest maternity colonies of Mexican free-tailed bats in Oklahoma, along with a smaller, closely watched population of the endangered Ozark big-eared bat, a species sensitive enough to disturbance that public access to the cave is restricted to a handful of guided evenings each summer. That single cave, sitting in the same rock unit as the void Renfro's crew broke into, is a reminder of how much genuine complexity gypsum karst in this part of Oklahoma produces without any need to reach beyond ordinary geology. Chambers large enough to house colonies of thousands of animals, passages that shift and collapse on human timescales, water tables that turn a dry chamber into a flooded one within a matter of weeks. Anyone weighing Renfro's account has to weigh it against a landscape already proven, on the public record, to produce the strange without any help at all. Gypsum karst, the general term geologists use for cave systems carved into gypsum rock by dissolution, behaves differently from the more familiar limestone karst found in places like the Ozarks. Gypsum dissolves in water roughly 100 times faster than limestone does, which means gypsum caves tend to form on shorter timescales and collapse or backfill more readily, leaving fewer large, stable chambers than limestone country typically produces. A geologist reading Renfro's account today has a straightforward first explanation available: a rare, unusually stable dissolution chamber, its walls smoothed and flattened by a slow, sheet-like flow of mineral-saturated water over a very long period, rather than the branching, scalloped flow that produces the more familiar cave shapes. Its dryness explained by a natural seal of redeposited gypsum somewhere above it, that had, until Renfro's crew broke through, kept groundwater from reaching it at all. That explanation accounts for the flat walls, accounts for the dryness, and accounts for the cool, still air trapped inside a sealed pocket of rock. It does not, on its own, explain why the mine superintendent came down from the office that same afternoon, or why the company's response to an unusual but not unprecedented geological feature was to treat it, from that day forward, as a matter to be handled quietly rather than logged and reported to the state the way company procedure otherwise required. The consulting geologist whose report had logged the crosscut area as fault-free before Renfro's crew ever reached it was a young graduate of Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College named Wendell Kirby Sass, hired by Cimarron Gypsum on a part-time contract basis in the years before the company could afford a full-time staff geologist of its own, a common arrangement for small operators throughout the gypsum belt at the time. County business directories from the period list Sass as an active mining consultant across Major, Woodward, and Dewey counties through the late 1940s, his name appearing on permit filings and assay requests with some regularity. After 1949, his name stops appearing in any surviving Oklahoma mining record. A brief item in a Stillwater alumni bulletin from 1951 places him instead in private petroleum consulting work in Texas, a shift the bulletin describes only as a new opportunity, with no mention of gypsum, of Major County, or of the work he had done there. Career changes of that kind were common in a state whose oil industry could pay a young geologist far more than a small plaster company ever could, and nothing in the surviving record suggests Sass left under any pressure at all. What the record does show, plainly, is a geologist who examined that exact stretch of ground closely enough to certify it clean in his professional report, and who was gone from gypsum work entirely within 2 years of the afternoon that certification proved wrong. Oklahoma had maintained a state department of mines since statehood, tasked with inspecting underground workings for safety hazards and requiring operators to report unusual conditions, roof falls, and water inflows as a matter of routine compliance. The inspection ledger for major county mining operations in that period survives today in the state archives in Oklahoma City, available to any researcher who requests it, and it shows a visit to the Cimarron Gypsum property on a date 19 days after the shift log entry describing the void. The inspector's report from that visit, brief and typewritten on a standard form, notes the crosscut in question as sealed, and states that the void encountered had been backfilled for roof stability, a routine and unremarkable notation that appears elsewhere in the same ledger for other mines in other counties in other years. What the report does not include, and what company procedure at comparable mines of that era generally required for any void large enough to halt production for even a few hours, is any measurement of the chamber's dimensions, any description of its contents, or any explanation of what backfilling method was used. The word the family account uses, consistently across 3 generations of retelling, is not backfilled, it is drowned. According to Renfro's daughter, who gave the fullest surviving version of the story to a County Historical Society volunteer in the early 1990s, her father described watching a pipeline strung down the crosscut over the following week. Drawing from a natural brine spring the company already used to supply salt to a small stock salt operation it ran on the side of its plaster business. A common enough secondary trade for gypsum country operators sitting on top of the same Permian evaporite system that produces natural brine springs throughout the region, including the well-documented salt licks along the Cimarron and the larger commercially worked salt plains near Cherokee. Pumping brine into an unstable void to control roof pressure was, and remains, a legitimate engineering technique in evaporite mining used historically at salt and gypsum operations to stabilize a cavity by filling it with a dense fluid that resists collapse better than air alone, a technique geologists today would recognize immediately and would not consider unusual on its face. What troubled Renfro, according to his daughter, was not that the company sealed the void, it was that he was reassigned off that crosscut, permanently within the same week, given no explanation beyond a foreman's instruction to work a different section of the mine, and that 2 of the 3 men who had gone in to look with him were let go from the company entirely before the end of that same month, for reasons the family account says were never given to them in writing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What Renfro kept, according to the family, was a single piece of the rock he had broken off the chamber wall before the crosscut was sealed, a flat grey-white fragment, roughly the size of a dinner plate, that his daughter remembered sitting on a shelf in the family's storm cellar for most of her childhood, used at various points as a doorstop, and, during at least one Sunday dinner she could recall specifically, as a trivet for a hot pan, entirely without ceremony. What made it worth keeping at all, in her account, was a pattern pressed into one face of it, a series of shallow parallel grooves crossed at a consistent angle by a second set of grooves, evenly spaced in a way she said her father insisted no water ever moving through soft rock could produce on its own. A geologist examining that description today has a second explanation ready alongside the first. Slickensides, the smooth grooved surfaces produced when 2 blocks of rock grind against each other along a fault plane, common in tectonically active ground and not unknown in the Blaine Formation, which does carry minor faulting in places despite the mine's original geological survey describing the crosscut area as fault-free. Slickenside grooves can appear strikingly regular, occasionally crossing at consistent angles where a rock mass has moved along more than one plane over time, and to an untrained eye, working by carbide lamp 40 feet underground, with no way to measure the pattern against a known reference, a genuine geological structure and a deliberately worked surface can look very much alike. That is the explanation a geologist would reach for first, and it may well be correct. It is also not the explanation Otis Renfro reached for, according to the one account that survives him, and it is worth being precise about the difference between those 2 positions rather than collapsing them into one. The fragment itself no longer exists in any condition that could resolve the question either way. Renfro's daughter told the Historical Society volunteer that the storm cellar flooded during a spring storm in 1965, and that the rock, already softened by decades of humidity and handling, had crumbled into loose fragments by the time anyone thought to move it, the grooved face gone soft and unreadable along with the rest of it. No photograph of it is known to survive. No sample was ever sent to Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College, the land-grant institution in Stillwater that housed the state's most active geology department at the time, and that would be renamed Oklahoma State University in 1957, though the family account does mention that Renfro considered writing to the school and was talked out of it by his wife, who worried, in a detail his daughter repeated more than once across different tellings, about drawing further attention from the company. That single unrecorded decision, a letter that was drafted in conversation but never sent to an institution with the trained staff and instruments to examine the fragment properly, is the exact point at which this account crosses from a claim that might have been tested into a claim that can now only be described. The pattern of institutional silence surrounding Renfro's account looks different when set against a case from the same general region and the same general industry where the opposite happened, and the state was forced to respond publicly and quickly. On November 20, 1980, an oil exploration crew working a Texaco drilling rig on Lake Peigneur in southern Louisiana accidentally punched into the top of an active Diamond Crystal Salt Company mine operating in a salt dome roughly 1,500 feet beneath the lake bed. Within hours, the entire lake, along with barges, part of a botanical garden, and the drilling platform itself, was draining down through the breach into the mine workings below, reversing the flow of the canal that normally fed the lake, and pulling it backward with enough force to briefly create the largest waterfall in the state of Louisiana. No miners were killed, largely because the mine's alarm systems gave the crew below enough warning to evacuate before the flooding reached them, but the mine itself was destroyed permanently, and the incident produced an immediate, well-documented public investigation by state and federal regulators, precisely because it happened in daylight, on the surface, in front of witnesses with cameras, leaving no institution any real option to treat it quietly. A second case, less sudden but comparably instructive, unfolded at the Retzoff salt mine near the town of Retzoff in Livingston County, New York, then the largest operating rock salt mine in North America. In March of 1994, a section of the mine's roof failed catastrophically at a depth of over 1,000 feet, opening a connection to overlying groundwater that flooded the workings faster than any pumping system could keep pace with, eventually forcing the permanent closure of a mine that had operated continuously since the 1880s and had employed hundreds of workers in the surrounding communities. Unlike the Cimarron Gypsum crosscut, the Retzoff collapse produced measurable surface subsidence large enough to damage roads and buildings above ground, drawing state geological survey teams and federal mine safety investigators to the site within days, and generating a public record, still available today through the New York State Museum's Geological Survey archive, detailed enough to reconstruct the mechanics of the failure almost floor by floor. What connects Lake Peigneur, Retzoff, and the account of Otis Renfro's crosscut is not any shared cause, since a drilling error, a natural roof collapse, and an unexplained void are three different kinds of event entirely. What connects them is that evaporite mining, whether for gypsum, rock salt, or potash, routinely runs into the physical limits of rock that dissolves, deforms, and occasionally opens onto spaces the original geological survey did not predict, and that the difference between a case the public remembers and a case that disappears into a single shift log line has consistently come down to whether the failure happened where witnesses with authority and reach were already watching. A third, smaller scale pattern is worth naming alongside those two, because it shows the same dynamic operating at a scale closer to Renfro's own experience. The underground salt mine at Hutchinson, Kansas, cut into a Permian salt bed roughly 650 feet down and part of the same broad evaporite system that extends south into Oklahoma, has documented, in its own company and regulatory history, multiple instances of unexpected voids and water inflows over more than a century of continuous operation, each one handled according to standard engineering practice, and each one reported, as federal law has required since the creation of the Mine Safety and Health Administration in 1977, to government inspectors as a matter of routine compliance rather than public announcement. The Hutchinson Mine's own archived safety records show that an unexpected void, even a significant one, is treated today as unremarkable paperwork precisely because the reporting requirement exists and is enforced. Renfro's crosscut predates that federal requirement by nearly 3 decades, encountered in an era when a small regional operator's obligation to disclose an underground anomaly extended no further than a state inspection ledger an inspector filled out largely from the company's own account of events, with no independent verification required at all. The gap between what evaporite mining must disclose today and what it had to disclose in 1948 is not a small technicality. It is close to the entire reason a case like Lake Peigneur produced a public paper trail within hours, and a case like Renfro's produced one typewritten line. Cimarron Gypsum and Plaster Company itself did not survive long enough to answer any of the questions Renfro's account raises. Company records held by the Oklahoma Historical Society show the operation was sold to a larger regional gypsum concern in 1957, and the Ames area shaft was abandoned entirely by 1963. Its surface buildings salvaged for lumber, and its portal sealed with a standard concrete plug, a fate common to dozens of small gypsum mines across Major and Woodward counties as the industry consolidated around larger, more efficient operators through the 1950s and 1960s. No environmental or engineering survey was conducted on the abandoned shaft before it was sealed, which was standard practice for the period rather than any special treatment given to this particular mine, and no subsequent landowner has requested the kind of geophysical survey that might locate the original crosscut and the chamber inside it without physically reopening a mine shaft that has stood sealed for over 60 years. The land above it today is unremarkable grazing pasture, crossed by a county road and a single strand of barbed wire fence, indistinguishable on the surface from thousands of acres of similar ground across the gypsum belt, holding no marker, no plaque, and no indication to anyone standing on it that a mine ever operated beneath their boots at all. Otis Renfro left mining entirely within 2 years of the incident, taking work instead at a grain elevator in Ames that his daughter said he preferred, specifically because it kept him above ground, a preference she recalled him stating plainly rather than explaining, in the same understated way he seems to have discussed the crosscut itself for the rest of his life. He never filed a claim against the company, never spoke to a newspaper, and never, as far as the family account indicates, pursued the matter with the State Department of Mines beyond whatever brief conversation may have prompted that unusually prompt inspection 19 days after the discovery, a conversation no surviving document confirms took place at all. He died in 1979, a decade before his daughter gave her account to the Historical Society, and is buried in a small cemetery outside Ames within a few miles of the sealed shaft, a detail she mentioned without apparent significance attached to it, simply as a fact of where the family had always buried its dead. The account his daughter gave survives today in the collections of the Major County Historical Society, filed among several dozen other oral history transcripts collected from area residents during the same volunteer effort in the early 1990s, available to any researcher who submits a request to view it, though it has, by the Society's own records, been requested only a handful of times in the 3 decades since it was recorded. It sits a short drive from the Oklahoma Geological Survey's own core and sample repository in Norman, where catalogued rock specimens from mines across the state, including several from the Brine Formation gypsum belt, are stored and made available for study by any credentialed geologist who requests them, a formal, continuously maintained archive built for exactly the kind of specimen Renfro broke off the chamber wall and kept, briefly, as a doorstop instead. What remains of this account today is precisely 3 things: a single line in a company shift log describing an unexpected void and nothing more, a state mine inspection report filed 19 days later noting the void as backfilled without measurement or description, and one woman's retelling, recorded decades after the fact, of what her father told her about a chamber with flat walls, cool, dry air, a pattern of grooves cut into rock that crumbled before anyone with the right training ever examined it, and a company response swift enough to end 3 men's work on that crosscut within the same week the void was found. Nothing in the geological record of the Brine Formation rules out a natural explanation for any single piece of that account taken alone: a stable dissolution chamber, slickened side grooves, mistaken in poor light for something deliberate, a routine brine stabilization job handled without the paperwork state procedure technically required of it. What the record does not offer is an explanation for why all of those pieces arrived together, on the same afternoon, at the same crosscut, and were followed within days by a level of company urgency that the mine's own surviving records never applied to any other void logged across 15 years of operation. The sealed shaft above Eagle Chief Creek sits today under the same Oklahoma sky that watched Cimarron Gypsum's trucks haul plaster rock east to Enid for a decade and a half, under the same wind that moves across the Glass Mountains and the Great Salt Plains and every exposed edge of the Brine Formation for 100 miles in every direction. The same formation that gave up its catalogued selenite to state geologists in one county, and according to one family's carefully kept and ultimately unprovable memory, gave up something it has not given up again in the county next door. Whatever is or is not still sitting behind that concrete plug remains exactly where it was the week Otis Renfro was moved to a different section of the mine and told nothing further about it. Undisturbed, unexamined, and for now simply still there, a few miles from a cave the state opens to the public every season, and a few miles more from a salt flat where anyone with a shovel and a state permit is welcome to dig. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.